Mr. Zero HP Lovecraft. How you doing, sir?
Hello, thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, sir. My pleasure. Mr. Lovecraft, I haven't traditionally used Twitter. So, unfortunately, I didn't really come into his sphere and learn about his work until sort of recently when I finally broke down and made a Twitter for the Bizarre Archives. He popped up right away because, you know, we at the Bizarre Archives, we do cosmic horror. We do that kind of stuff. I saw this guy's name, Zero HP Lovecraft. I was like, I got to go check out what this guy's doing. I actually sent him a message, like, hey, man, what do you think about us? And blah, blah, blah. And he actually gave us, a retweet and checked us out and gave me some good feedback and everything. And ever since then, I've been watching, reading his tweets. And this guy is just a take machine. This guy just puts out so many great takes on so many great things. Everything from political ideas to art and also... my favorite stuff that he does is probably advice for writers because we're going to get right into that. I'm going to bring that up in a minute. But Mr. Zero, how'd you get started writing? Because you're kind of like you're like a I don't want to say a rags to riches story, but you're kind of really a self-made, self-propelled writer. Could you tell us a little bit about your writing journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've talked about this a bit before, but I always wanted to be a writer. I was always interested in the craft, but I realized when I was probably in college, I tried to write a lot of short stories, and I realized at one point that they were terrible. All of them were terrible. I said to myself, like, I have a certain technical aptitude for this. I can put sentences together. But I had nothing to say. I had nothing of value to say. And I'd read my own stories and I thought they were just vapid and empty and pointless. So I made a very conscious decision when I was like right around maybe a senior in college. I said, I'm just going to stop this until I'm older, until I know what the fuck I'm doing. And when the time was right, I felt like writing again. I was reading about Murakami, who didn't start writing until he was much, much older in life. And he just one day was at a baseball game out of the blue and thought, I could write a novel. And he did. And now he's this internationally renowned and world famous author. And I had a very similar feeling where I was reading stories, fan fiction, actually. So there's this sort of emergent trend in the rationalist sphere. Maybe you've heard of Scott Alexander or some of these types of people, the less wrong. I'm not a huge advocate of them, but they do have their own kind of Bay Area culture. And one of the things they do is they write sort of weird and science fiction-y and like mathematical stories that deal with a lot of strange topics in philosophy. And so I was very interested and inspired by that. And I read a story called The Northern Caves by a guy called the Nostalgibrist, like algebraist, like one who does algebra, but nostalgia. And his story, it was really, really good, and it was also really terrible in some ways. Like, I loved it. I loved so many things about it, but I also thought it had bad metaphysical qualities that I wanted to fix. So I sort of set off on my own path, inspired by that and by Lovecraft, obviously, and by Shane Carruth, who is like a kind of an author, amateur director. I was really inspired by his work as well. And I just put together a story. I had 50 followers on Twitter. No one knew who I was. I wrote it. It took me 8 months. And I agonized over this story. I mean, I wrote it every day, and I didn't think anyone would read it. I didn't think anyone would care. I didn't think I thought 20 people were going to read this story. And I posted it, and it just went viral. And it got like 100,000 people clicking through to read it in less than a year. And I said, well, people like to hear what I have to say, so I guess I'm going to keep talking. And that's really that.
That's great. That's awesome. So, getting into, I mean, obviously you took on the name Zero HP Lovecraft. Would you say that Lovecraft would be one of your bigger influences?
Yes and no. So at the time, there was this very trendy way of naming yourself with like a before and after. For example, there was someone called Jared Taylor Swift, that I thought was a really funny name. Yeah, and there were so many of those, so many of these like two names jammed together, joined in a particular word. And I just thought it was, well, I'd written this sort of story modeled after an H.P. Lovecraft story. I'm interested in cosmic horror, obviously, and in these types of topics, but I didn't really intend it to be like, oh, I'm Lovecraft. That's my identity. That's who I am, you know, Lovecraft reborn or something. And my favorite author, my biggest writing influence is actually Borges, more so than Lovecraft, though I do love H.P. Lovecraft as well. But you know, it's something that I guess, I hate to say this, it almost sounds cynical, but it's a very marketable name. People really, I accidentally stumbled on a name that people found intriguing and maybe sort of darkly appealing, and it stuck.
Yeah, well, yeah, H.P. Lovecraft is an enigma. You know what I mean? He might be my favorite author. Between him and Robert E. Howard are like I just think that those guys were just so brilliant. So you mentioned cosmic horror. We gotta talk a little bit about that. I love cosmic horror. I can't get enough of it. Most of it is not what I want it to be, but I just can't get enough. I check out there, for example, there's a YouTube channel called Cosmic Films, and it's like this guy and his wife and a couple of their buddies, and they put together these kind of campy little horror short films, and I just can't get enough. I just watch this stuff because I just adore it. What would you say, when did you get into cosmic horror, and how would you define cosmic horror? Because there's some debate around that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I've talked a little bit before about the connections between Borges and Lovecraft and their similarities. And for me, I actually think my on-ramp to this genre was not even any book at all. It was 4chan. And they used to have these threads called Creepypasta, kind of like copy pasta, but creepy, yeah. And so the idea behind these stories is they're very punk rock in a way. They're not something that's produced. They're not supposed to be literary. The writing is not particularly good. In fact, it's oftentimes it's horrible. And this is all part of the aesthetic, is the idea that it's this kind of folk horror that anyone, even if they don't have much writing ability, can write and participate in. And if they find something scary or a thought that is, you know, kind of terrifying, they can write it up, and you go into it knowing that it's very amateur. And I love that. I read so many of these stories. I love these little threads. Some of the most famous ones are Candle Cove, the Russian Sleep Experiment. There was one about Disneyland, I forget, but it's like a story where a guy finds like secret tunnels in like an abandoned Disney theme park, and then meets this kind of eldritch version of Mickey Mouse. And there's so many of these. I mean, there's hundreds. The Keepers of the End is a really famous one, or a couple of these stories that are kind of in the same vein that have broken out was like the Nine Mother, Nine Eyes, Nine Horse, something like that. This fellow just started writing something that felt like a creepypasta, but he would post it in comments of random Reddit threads that had nothing to do with his story at all. And he threaded this sort of narrative through Reddit, completely, almost with violent inattention to the structure of the medium. And that was a really great experiment. There was another one called the Dionia House, which is about like a house that's also a Venus flytrap, and it lures people inside and then eats them. So like really, really awful, campy stuff in a way, like low quality, but it creates this vibe. And what I would always do is I'd go read these stories, and I would read them until I felt satiated. Like there's almost something you're looking for. Like if you read enough of them, you get this very unusual high where you feel sort of derealized, and like I wouldn't call it like a break with reality or anything as dramatic as that, but you read it until you kind of feel disturbed. I would say that's the approach. And it's a very unusual kind of intoxication. So I try to find a way to create that feeling in my work.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I actually I talked about the old creepypastas. I actually referred to them as neo pulp because it sort of has that old school pulp vibe that guys got when they read like Weird Tales magazine. When we look at Weird Tales magazine, we look at Amazing Stories, Startling Stories, and like these old publications. We think of the greats that come out of them, right? We think about Lovecraft, we think about Howard, we think about Clark Ashton Smith, Donald Wandre, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Philip Francis Nolan, the list goes on. We think of the greats, but what I really love is I'm a big fan of buying the old reprints of these old pulp magazines, because mixed in with the great stories is just tons of kitsch and just low quality stuff. And just so here's an example. In one of the issues that I have has my favorite pulp bad story. I forget what it's called. It's called like the Phantom at Midnight or something like that. It's really short. It's about like 700 words, and effectively the entirety of the story is there's a guy in his apartment, and every night at midnight, mysteriously his door swings ajar, and he goes through this night after night until eventually he pulls his revolver from his desk and he flings the door open to confront whatever phantom is there. But the window was open, and it was the wind the whole time. And I just love this story because in these pulp magazines, it's always some sort of supernatural or ethereal thing that goes on. But in this, he gives us this goofy little bait and switch that it was the wind the whole time. And I love that kitschy, lumpy, kind of imaginative quality that the creepypastas had, that very much mirrored the old school pulp, which was sometimes just lumpy but interesting for some reason. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's great, and you have a really great voice for delivering this kind of horror as well. I think, but I appreciate that almost anti-horror. It's like a shaggy dog story. It's building you up to this payoff that you expect, and then kind of pulling the rug. Yeah. You wouldn't want most of the stories to be like that, but once in a while, as a comment on the genre, it can be really insightful, and it can sort of show you the scenes a little bit in a useful way.
Yeah, I just love weirdness. You know what I mean? I have this term, I call it high weirdness. And that's anything that has this kind of just random, psychedelic, imaginative quality. And I find that modern horror and modern art in general lacks this. To me, it's very homogenized and very sterile and uniform. It doesn't really aesthetically give you anything unexpected. I think that this change happened somewhere in the late 90s or 2000s, and this only really survives in places like 4chan and maybe like some indie publishers, and also like guys like you, and like what you're doing is like it has this offbeat weirdness to what you're writing. I mean, it's like conveying meaningful things, but it's also has this weirdness to it. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, so you've probably read an essay or two by Lovecraft on this exact topic. He had a few meditations on what exactly the weirdness is in weird fiction and what he's looking for. He has a really great history where he talks about what he considers to be the sort of rise and development of weird fiction over several centuries, and he starts
supernatural
with kind of
horror in literature was the essay, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. So I think my understanding of what is weird in fiction is deeply informed by that, and it's something, in a way, it's as cliche as wrestling with the unknown. So one thing that we have in an internet age and in an age of mass media, and especially because we have such powerful ability to create computer graphics, is people are far too ready to try to show you the monster, to try to show you the horrific thing. Mm-hmm. And also, we've had so many horror stories where we've explored, these different facets of what is scary and what is weird, that those things become normal. So to find something that's truly other, something that's truly outside of our experience, it takes something extra. It's no longer enough to just write about sort of these classic tropes like, okay, you can have a haunted house, you can have a gateway to another dimension. But there have been so many stories about other dimensions and alien beings. And Lovecraft himself, he kind of pioneered a lot of these horror tropes that we now take for granted. But because those things are known quantities now, because we can all go read Mountains of Madness or Call of Cthulhu, it's like, how can we be scared or shocked by that again? We can't. It's so much that people make like Cthulhu plushies. And I think if you read the real stories by Lovecraft, there is still something that's haunting, and they do still have an otherness to them that isn't there in most of his imitators. But you have to be willing to genuinely break outside of what is normal and what is expected and what is safe. And there's a false horror in retreading the tropes of the genre. You have to go beyond if you're going to find something outside.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. There are obviously you can reuse tropes and do them tastefully and still be entertaining. For example, if you're writing a sword and sorcery story, you can have a big muscular jacked guy save a girl and kill a monster, and everybody's gonna like it and everybody's gonna be excited about it because you can just do that. That's just what it is, right? With horror, you're trying to scare or unsettle the audience, and this is something that just can't be recreated over and over again. If you really want to freak out your audience, you almost have to create something sort of new, or at least use something that isn't that well known. So when you're, I think nowadays, the reason that Lovecraft and cosmic horror is really gaining steam again, and you mentioned this earlier about how people are so desensitized, right? Every horror movie has a haunted house. Every horror movie has all this gore, has jump scares, and like we're so desensitized to it that it doesn't really scare us anymore. So what we kind of need to do is go back into the realm that Lovecraft was and create these like conceptually bizarre ideas. We have to like attack people in the recesses of their minds in order to unsettle them, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of that is being able and willing to unsettle yourself.
Yeah.
Like you have to personally live through at least you have to imagine the exact things that you're trying to provoke in your audience. If you don't have, it's not even about empathy for the audience. It's about genuinely inhabiting the mental space that you're trying to create. How are you going to make other people feel disturbed? How are you going to make other people feel scared if you can't scare yourself? Like, I think the process of writing one of these horror stories, really, it has to be first and foremost a process of terrifying yourself. And I honestly, if I'm in the middle of this process and I'm writing a story, then I must feel the horror personally in order to convey it. So sometimes you can go to a very dark place, and I think you're not going to write something dark if you can't go to that place.
Yeah,
I
agree completely. When I'm writing, when I want to create something, and I like to put a little touch of horror in just about everything that I do, because I love spooky dark shit. It's cool, right? I just love it. So even when I'm writing my action fantasy kind of stuff, one of the things that, like, for example, one of my stories that gets pointed out a lot as like their favorite of my most spooky things that I wrote a story called Lex and the Horror of Burnwick Hollows. And it's a story about my hero. His name's Lucius Lex. And, long story short, he goes into this abandoned like cave, and there's these like humanoid spider creatures. And a lot of people have said that this story freaks them out more than anything else that I wrote, because the idea of an amalgam between a man and a spider like really made their skin crawl. And I was like, wow, I just put that in there just because I had like this nightmare about these like weird spider thing, and it makes me cringe when I think about it. So you're right. If when you're trying to put these elements into your writing and you expect them to scare other people, you have to know that it scares you first.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people are unnerved by the concept of spider-human hybrids, then they should definitely not Google for anime spider girls. That would be a terrible thing to
do. I'm gonna Google it right now, actually. But so let's you just put out a book with it was called There's No Deepness of Earth, right? That's a compilation
of
all right?
Deepness of Earth.
Yeah, which I love the title.
This story, thank you. It is from the King James Bible, and this is another piece of advice that, well, it comes from many places, but it does come from Lovecraft as well. That if you want to improve the quality of your writing, and especially if you want to create this sense of outsideness, the King James Bible is an incredible place to look. And I don't know, regardless of one's personal beliefs, it's just a fantastic book. It's amazingly written, and it creates, like, not only its use of language, but there is something, again, regardless of what you believe, there's something very otherworldly to many of the stories in Christianity, and especially some of the Gospels. I think there are, in a way, and some people might hear this a bit blasphemously, but I don't mean it that way. Mm-hmm. There is an element of the Lovecraftian in the Gospels and the stories of Jesus Christ. And I think you can find that and you can look for it and really appreciate it as a brush with, like, even just in the logic of a story, with an eternal and ancient God. Like, that's not the lightest topic.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the depictions of the angels, right? I'm not sure if you've seen them, but there's people have made like 3D.
The biblically accurate angels.
Yeah. They're freaky looking. They literally look like something they look like eldritch horrors. They're terrifying.
Truly.
All right, very cool. So when you're talking, now that we're talking about, I want to go back on to some like the nature of weirdness and fear and everything like that. I just did a lecture with the White Art Collective talking about the nature of horror. And when I boil down horror, I boil it down to true horror contains one or more of these four elements, and I boiled them down to fear, which I put it as a just a biological reaction to something that is dangerous, right? I put down disgust. Obviously when you watch horror movies, antagonists are often depicted as drippy and wet or have open sores. Freddy Krueger with his burnt face, all that. But I also put in weirdness, which I define as something. So I kind of go a little bit deep into this. I want to get your thoughts on how I define weirdness. So I define weirdness. I go back to the Saxon word, which is weird, right? In was that Macbeth? You have the weird sisters. It's mentioned in Beowulf. It's a Saxon word. It's coterminous to the Norse understanding of Urlog, as well as the Hindu principle of Urta or Dharma. And pretty much what it means is the operating system of reality, fate, time, etc., etc. And when we say something is weird today, it's the same word as it was in the Saxon times. When we say something is weird in common parlance, what we're referencing is saying that something that kind of distorts our sense of reality, our understanding, our relationship, our perception of reality, right? So when we say something is weird, this is something that defies, it doesn't make sense, it defies the laws of reality and how we understand them. So in my opinion, that's why things that have high weirdness often have like very psychedelic kind of qualities. What do you think about my definition of weird there?
Well, so it's interesting the way you used the term psychedelic. I I personally am not really an advocate of these types of drugs, although I have used them a little bit. I think that one of the things that psychedelics do is they give you, for better or worse, a feeling of profundity. That is, they make everything seem like a revelation.
Yeah.
And so there's something kind of adjacent to weird in the way that you're talking about it. It etymologically, it sort of refers to fate or fortune or chance. And so I think about how the idea of a revelation also feels like if we think of it as something that comes from the outside, you don't just read and have a revelation. A revelation is something that comes to you from outside of your own sphere of possibility, even. So I think that there's this tie-in between the psychedelics, which give you this kind of random walk and make everything feel profound, and a sort of profundity that you also get when you have this sense of disturbance because you have encountered something which is weird. I don't know if that's quite what you're looking for, but I have drawn from this myself in my story, Don't Make Me Think. In particular, I read a lot of Arrowhead trip reports, and I sort of tried to incorporate some ideas from Alexander Shulgin and some of that format of phenethylamines I've known and loved. I don't know if you're familiar with this book.
No, I'm not. I am familiar with Earwid, though. It's been a long time since I heard that.
Yeah. So people talk about the experiences they have on DMT or on high heroic doses of acid and so on. And I think that this can be a really useful place to look for inspiration for a horror story, because you have, again, like I said, this sense of chance, of things just sort of shifting randomly, and you feel maybe tossed a little bit around by fate when you take these drugs. So you can read these stories and you can see what people have experience. There's almost like swirling chaos of dream logic in their psychedelic trips, and the things that strike them are not things that would probably strike them if they were sober. So I sometimes do read from this type of literature when I'm looking for a horrific experience. And what makes it horrific, in my opinion, is not just the tropes, it's not just the incomprehensibility, but it's the way that sometimes something very mundane, something banal, can suddenly spring to prominence, and there's not really a clear explanation for why that particular object or image is juxtaposed into your revelation, into your trip. And so I think it's the presence of certain inexplicable banalities that can really heighten that sense of weirdness.
Yeah, that's I was using psychedelic in more of an aesthetic kind of way, but what you're talking about here is really interesting and something that comes to mind. I've experimented with psychedelic drugs as well. One of the things that's really stuck with me. One time, I was me and the boys when we were younger, were dosed up on some acid, right? And we go to the store, and we went to go get snacks. It was a terrible idea. We shouldn't have been going out in public and everything. We were all going nuts. But I go to the counter, right? And I can't even remember what I was buying. I was buying drinks or snacks or just something. And the cashier tells me how much it is, and I just could not figure it out. The idea of money having value, numerical value, like numbers as a whole, none of this made any sense to me. And I pretty much just made a complete idiot of myself. The cashier's looking at me like I'm a psychopath. Like, what is this crazy guy even talk? And I'm like bursting out and I'm like, money, what does that even mean? What is numbers? Like, I'm like just being weird, right? So eventually my friend who was like he's like, dude, you gotta give him this much money. I'm like trying to give this lady like $150. She's asking for $6.50. But he helps me out, we leave. But later on, like I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I have never in my life even considered that the value of numbers may not be as solid as it is. What if numbers don't actually mean anything and we just put this value on it? Money, what does that even mean? And what this did is actually led me into like researching about like monetary policy and like stuff like that. So you're right that when you take these things, everything feels like an epiphany, even though it's not. It's like something. Most of the time, it's just some retarded thing that you're just looking at. It just doesn't make no sense to you. But what I found that it does is it kind of forces you to question these mundane things. And a lot of these experiences have helped me in my writing to make things that are actually conceptually psychedelic and truly weird. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. And as soon as you started talking about the nature of Monday, I was thinking that how many people have had a very similar experience, not through drugs, but by trading cryptocurrency. And that to me is kind of not the goal, but it is a goal of writing something weird, is to actually, without drugs, shock you out of your kind of normal channels where you just take these things for granted. It's like if you take drugs and you question the nature of money, okay, that's an experience that in a way is expected, and it sort of makes you laugh at people who take drugs.
Yeah.
So if you can read a book instead, totally sober, and have that same experience of questioning these fundamental assumptions, then I think the drugs start to feel like a cheap shortcut to something which can be, genuinely profound, as opposed to sort of artificially induced profundity.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that at all. I am still an advocate of microdosing psilocybin mushrooms because they do have really strong medicinal qualities and stuff like that. But I'm 34 years old. I got 3 kids. I'm not dosing up on acid. I don't have time for I mean, I would have a terrible time. Yeah, and I've had too many friends that got into the goofy hippie stuff, and they fried their brains out taking this stuff all the time, and it's just everything in moderation.
Yeah, well, this is the problem. When you start to believe that everything and anything can be profound, then it's very easy to become infatuated with complete nonsense.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, how do people protect themselves against that? And I think in a lot of cases they don't. They think, oh, well, as long as I don't have a bad trip, as long as I don't, go to a dark place, that's just fine. But there's a much deeper danger, which isn't going to a dark place at all. It's going to a completely ordinary place and mistaking it for a revelation.
Yeah.
And this is a different kind of spiritual pitfall, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's I'm gonna chew on that for a while. I think that's a really, really strong take. So I also wanted to ask you about this, and I want to bring it up and talk about it. I retweeted one of your tweets recently, and it was, I'm a big fan of guys that say things in brevity, that just say a lot in a few words. And you gave out some writing advice to writers that I thought was probably the best advice. And I've said it too in different words, but the way you put it, you said something along the lines of, do not let the perfect stop you from the good.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the classic phrase is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And not always true. But I find this tendency so much in myself. It's so easy to just sit there, picking and tweaking and changing things. And not even changing things that mean anything. Like, sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good to agonize over a single sentence and write it 100 times and look for that exact correct expression of your will. But at some point, you kind of have to balance the realization that if you change 1% of this work, that doesn't really offset the other 99%. And people who experience your work, they may be struck by some little detail and some little flourish that you put in. So it's not as if you should just abandon that. But at some point you have to say, there are no more substantial changes to be made to this, and you just have to push it out there and move on to the next thing. And I was struggling with that with I have my own podcast now, and it took me a long time to write episode 3 because it's a difficult topic. And at some point I realized I was playing with my food. I just needed to eat the meal and move on. So that's why I said that.
It's really crazy how different writers today approach the art as opposed to they did back then. In Lovecraft's time, they had a quote, and we still use it. We say pulp speed. they write at pulp speed. Because these guys, you told, especially like Lovecraft, the guy wrote how many stories? He ghost wrote how many stories? He wrote something to the tune of 100,000 letters. He was just so prolific, and that's not just him. One of my other favorites, Robert E. Howard. I have a book of his poetry that I just adore. I love those two guys. Their poetry is gorgeous, and folks that like that kind of stuff should absolutely check it out. It's criminally underrated. But anyway, I have a book of Robert E. Howard. Amazing. What's that?
Howard is amazing. Definitely.
Guy was a dragon. I've done so many shows talking about him and how interesting he was and everything.
Well, a detail you probably know, but something that always struck me is that he would practice reading and reciting all of his stories aloud to himself. After he wrote them, he would actually speak them, and he would change them because he believed that it was very important to capture the kind of verbal power of an oral tradition, because he was thinking, these stories he was writing about, like Conan and other kind of mythical characters, that their stories in their kind of native element would be passed down as an oral tradition. They'd be spoken. And so he wanted to capture that, and in order to do that, he made sure that it sounded good and felt right when he spoke it to himself. And I always thought that was such an incredible practice.
Yeah, oh man, you're speaking my language here. Howard, it gets depicted in one scene. If anybody's seen the movie Whole Wide World, it's actually about Nova Lynn Price, but it's about her relationship with Robert E. Howard. She's the only one that knew him in life that wrote down about it, right? So there's this one scene where she comes up and she hears some crazy yelling, and she like sneaks around to the back of the house. You hear tick, 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 tick from his typewriter, and you hear him. He's like, and then Conan reached his tree trunk arm and tore off her skirt, and he's just like shouting it like a maniac. Yeah, and I was like, that is so, because our ancient ancestors understood the power of spoken word, right? This is why we had oral traditions, and people had to memorize them, and they later on viewed written language as magic. And even in the classical world, when they started to really get into making sure they write things down, you still had to orally memorize it, because they believed spoken word was like the power of the gods. That was divine power when you could speak it, right? So and this is also why prayers are sung, right? You have everything from hymns to Galdar to Hindu mantras, and Buddhists and what they do, their mantras. Every religious practice that does these things sings their things. And it's like, it doesn't matter if you go to a Catholic church or an Orthodox church or a Buddhist temple or wherever, everybody is doing some sort of sung thing, because they know sound carries so much power. But I love that you pointed that out. But yeah, so that's really, really great stuff. Oh man, unfortunately we're starting to run out of time here. So I wanted to.
Yeah, I do apologize. We should wrap it up, but I'm happy to do a part 2 at a later time.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to have you back on. There's so much I want to talk to you about. But I wanted to bring up one more thing before we have to go, and I wanted to talk to you about the Passage Prize and your guys' huge success with this. I was actually about to do, Bizarchives was about to do a competition, and we paused it because we just wanted full focus on the Passage Prize. We wanted you guys to do your thing and everything like that. Can you tell us what inspired you to do the Passage Prize and kind of your experience with it, because I know you did a lot of work with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not the hero of the Passage Prize. That is definitely Lopez. I mean, he is just a machine when it comes to these things. He is like greasing palms and talking to the right people and doing all the legwork, the boring stuff, like getting legal compliance and figuring out the logistics of the money, stuff that, frankly, I would not choose to do myself, but I really appreciate that he took that on himself. And I think he just saw the potential of the space, realized how much creative energy is just languishing, and how a lot of stories that we want to tell now in this modern time are not really given a platform because they have diverged from the tastes of the people who control traditional publishing houses, something that I know you're well aware of.
Yes.
So I didn't really have too much to do with its inception. I mean, I was present for like the conversation where kind of Lomez pitched this idea and sort of developed it. But I didn't really do too much to get it started. He really got all the balls rolling. And I just, worked as a judge. You may hear that. I unfortunately have to take another call. I really apologize.
Hey, it's all good. Thank you so much for coming on, Mr. Zero, and I'll talk to you very soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a good one.
All right, excellent. That was Mr. Zero HP Lovecraft. We're going to have him on for a part 2. Unfortunately, both of us today had some things we have to get to, and I have to get going now as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed our conversation here, this exclusive interview for the Gumroad, Kulture Dad's exclusive interview. There's many more to come. So many great people I got lined up. We're going to have so much good podcast content for you guys that are subscribed. Awesome stuff. You go check out, I'm sure you guys are all subscribed already. So if you're not, go over to imperiumpress.org/podcast and go check out all of the awesome content there. And then also the Gumroad, there's an Imperium Press Substack, all that good stuff. Mr. Mike is working overtime to put out so many great books and great stuff for you guys. If you want to check out what I do, you can go over to thebizarchives.com or follow us on Twitter and Telegram at thebizarchives and get some cool pulp fiction, some weird fiction, up-and-coming, aspiring amateur fiction authors. Great stuff. We're working overtime over there. But I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation, and I'll see you guys next time for the next Kulture Dads episode. Hails and blessings.
You're listening to an episode of the latest Kulture Dads, Age of Sword and Cassette, where 2 fathers and community leaders discuss modern culture from a timeless perspective. Head on over to culturedads.com for podcasts every week.